What is your superpower?
I'd probably say my creativity.
Knowing nerdy trivia.
My superpower is being a good listener.
Devising a million questions.
Helping people.
Making people laugh.
My superpower is that I'm determined and never give up.
Hello, Erin. How are you doing today?
Good, Harry. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm very excited to announce our world-renowned. This is going to be a very exciting podcast. We've upped our level. We have a very special guest. But I was just thinking about something real fast before we jump into our guest, JD Barker. I just wanted to thank everyone. I've been promoting the podcast on LinkedIn, and a lot of people we've seen a lot of downloads. So thank you for joining our podcast, I guess. I don't know what else to say how we got here, but it's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah, shall we jump right into it?
Yeah, let's jump right in. JD, I'm the executive director at Meristem, and Harry and I threw this podcast together to just talk to different people in the autism community, in the workforce community, and hear your stories. And that's why we call it Voices of the Community. So we are excited
Right.
to hear your story. Do you want to start by sharing just a little bit of your biography and your story and how you got to where you're at now?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. It's funny because I've got a podcast called Writers Inc. Every week we interview a new author, and I did that primarily because being autistic, like the last thing I want to do is get out in front of people and talk, and I find that forcing myself to do it just makes it a little bit easier every week. Yeah. So do you want to start with the publishing side of things or the autistic side? I don't know where we even begin. I was diagnosed at 22, so I have
Okay.
like a before and after to my life.
Yeah, let's do it. I mean, I think it's really
Well,
cool because there's a lot of people that get diagnosed late, and it'd be interesting just to hear a little bit of your what was life like before the diagnosis came in, and then how did the diagnosis maybe help or not help, or and where that took you.
Sure. So I was born in the 70s. So back in the 70s, if you were autistic, they didn't try to diagnose you. Nobody looked at it. Like you were basically the weird kid that kind of pushed off into the corner. And I went through life that way. I had no idea that there was even something different about me. It became more and more apparent as I got older. And I think in a lot of ways, I kind of retreated into myself. Reading was something that I gravitated towards at a very early age. I grew up without a television in the house. So we were hitting the library from my earliest memories. I started reading around 3. I'd read all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew mysteries by the time I got into kindergarten. Then I went on to Charles Dickens. So that was always my safe space. If I needed to get away from the world, I'd kind of get lost in a book. But I had no trouble in school. I excelled more or less in all of my classes. Sometimes they put me ahead a couple of years and they brought me back a couple of years because they were trying to figure out the right place for me. And there never was a right place. But I got through it all. Ended up going, finished up high school. I went into college. I got a degree in business, another one in finance. I got halfway through a psychology degree. Ended up working in the corporate world for finance. I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm, which was perfectly suited to my personality because I got to stare at a computer all day long and monitor every trade that went through this brokerage firm and compare it to all these rules and regulations. The person that I inherited the job from actually did that on basically all in his head. He would take a printout of the previous day's trades, and he knew all the rules and regulations that the SEC had out there. So he would just go one at a time and figure out whether they were valid or not. I wrote computer code. It's something I had been very good at. It's something I excelled at when I was a kid. So I basically took all those manual processes and I wrote software in order to do them. So I enjoyed that. It was basically a problem somebody put in front of me. I had to solve it. But again, I had no clue I was autistic at the time. So I excelled at that portion of my job. I was great at doing working with the data, finding everything, handling all these rules and regs. But when somebody actually violated something, all of a sudden I had to get out of my office and I had to go and talk to somebody and I had to explain what they did wrong. And that was usually where stuff hit the fan, because I was not a people person. I did not understand why. I had never been able to socialize. I'd never been able to work well with others. And it became very clear because, like in this particular situation, it was already confrontational. I had to approach them because they did something they weren't supposed to. my boss basically saw the value of what I was doing on, the back office side of it. And he felt that I had an issue with anger. He thought that that was the problem. So he sent me to anger management classes. And I was in with a therapist for the very first session, basically an evaluation session. About 20 minutes in, she stopped me and she said, "Hey, have you ever been tested for autism?" And I had no idea what that even was. But she started explaining things to me. She said, "Well, the entire time we've been talking, you haven't made eye contact with me. I've noticed that your thumb and forefinger, every time you think, you rub them together, which is something I'm literally doing it right now. It's something I've always done." Um, she started pointing out all these things that, I had just taken, for granted as just part of me. And she pointed out that these were all signs of potential autism. So ultimately, I got tested and I was diagnosed with something called Asperger's. I think in today's world, they just say you're on the spectrum somewhere. But, back at this time, when I was 22, it actually had a name. And, again, that was a problem that somebody put in front of me. So once I had a name that I could attach to it, I just started researching it, looking for ways to correct it. Made a pros and cons list. These are the things that are hurting me because of this. These are the things that are benefits because of it, and kind of doubled down and focused on both. She taught me how to do simple things like make eye contact in a conversation. The funny thing is, like, when I make eye contact, and I'm guessing you guys probably go through this too, like, I literally have to tell myself the whole time that conversation is going on, maintain eye contact, maintain eye contact. I have to, like, force myself to do it. And if I look away, like, I can pretty much remember a conversation word for word. So my wife at this point, we've been married for 10 years now. She knows that if I'm not looking at her, that I'm actually paying attention. And if I make eye contact with her, she knows I'm not going to remember a single word of whatever it is we're talking about. So it's kind of the opposite. But one of the things that I had learned very early on, I had always written. I loved writing, loved reading. But I had been told at an early age it wasn't something I could make a living at. It was a good hobby, but you couldn't make a living as a writer, which is why I was in the corporate world. But I would come home at night and I would write to stay sane. And in social situations, as an autistic person, I mimic the behavior of other people. If I'm in a group and everybody else laughs, I laugh too, but I'm laughing because they're laughing. And that's a skill set that I've learned over time. And once I got that diagnosis, I was able to figure out not only how to do that, but, pretty much perfected in a way where other people don't notice. But one of the things that I also noticed is I can mimic people on paper. So if somebody puts a book in front of me or I read words written by another author, I can continue writing that story, but I can do it in their voice. I basically pick up on their vocabulary, their cadence, their voice patterns, and I could duplicate it to the point where it's not detectable. So I basically created a side hustle. I would work at night as a book doctor and a ghostwriter on other people's novels because of that particular skill set. So yeah, so it's been a crazy wild ride. I did that for a very long time. Then I guess about 10 years ago, my wife pulled me aside. She knew I wanted to become a full-time author, so we kind of pulled the trigger on a way to make that happen.
Yeah, wow. That's quite a
Well,
story. I mean, go
that's
for it,
pretty.
Harry.
That's well. I mean, well, I think that's a great. What do you think, Aaron? That's like the introduction of all introductions.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. There,
I wanted to
so,
like set the stage, JD, on the next thing I wanted to talk to you about. For the topic for today that you're going to speak on, but also uh, your writing, because I think that's really important. And just set the stage for people that don't know, you're actually, we have it all, the information here, but you're a New York Times bestselling author, for those that don't know, and apparently also an international bestselling author. So that's like a very impressive thing. You have a lot of novels that people might have heard about: Forsaken, The Fourth Monkey, Drackle. Yeah, if I could even read the one behind you, Heavy Stones, is that it? You've even been
Heavy are the stones.
what's that?
It's called Heavy Are the Stones. I know it's hard to
Uh,
read in the picture because words are really
uh,
small, but
you kind of your the types of books that you write about are suspense and supernatural. Um, that's sort of your and then the Drackle book is currently in development for film, and I also heard that there might be a mini series that you developed that for based on one of your books, which I just think is phenomenal. You've also collaborated with James Patterson. For those that are into books, he's like a big deal. And the topic for today, the intersection of autism and creativity. Well, I guess before we get into that topic, you could speak on how you got into your genre. Like, what about this genre that you're able to write about?
Yeah, so I mentioned I was working in the corporate world, but I would come home and I would write at night. So I did that for 2 decades, 23 years altogether. And over that time frame, I had 6 different books that hit the New York Times list, but they all had other people's names on the cover, even though I had written them. That's kind of how the book ghostwriting thing works. But it gets old after a while, knowing that you did the work and somebody else is basically getting credit for it. So my wife, who's way more daring than me, she came up with this crazy plan. She said, "Okay, this is what we're going to do. I know you want to become a full-time author." We were kind of trapped, because I had a big salary, we had a house, we had cars, we had a boat. Our lifestyle was expensive. We couldn't just walk away from it. So she came up with this crazy plan. We sold everything that we owned, literally every possession. We bought a tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh, rented out one side, and lived in the other side. Basically, got our expenses down to nothing. And then, sat down at the table one day and looked at the bank statement. And she said, "Okay, it looks like you have about 18 months to make this writer thing work. Go." Nothing like putting your feet to the fire to pursue something. And I got lucky. I wrote my, Forsaken was my first novel. I just had my 10-year anniversary since it was published about 2 weeks ago. I ended up selling about 250,000 copies, which was enough to, rock, the publishing industry a little bit and put me on the radar of the traditional guys. My next book was called The Fourth Monkey, which was a thriller set in Chicago. I ended up selling that one for 7 figures with a movie and a TV show attached. And it's just been kind of a wild ride ever since then. But I owe almost all of it to not only my wife for coming up with this crazy idea, because if she hadn't forced me to do it, I would have taken the safe route. I would have still be sitting behind a desk doing that job that I hated, and writing on the side. But she forced me to go down that particular path. But I don't think I would be writing today without autism, because it allows me to do what I do. Like when I write a story, I see the framework of a story. Like you can't really see my desk in the video here, but like there's literally nothing on my desk right now other than my Mac. But I'm working on 8 different books right now, all at the same time, and they're all up here. They're all in my head. Like I can come up with some crazy intricate plot lines, and it's because of autism. It's the same reason I was very good at computer code. If you've ever written computer code, when you write that very first line of code, you have to understand how it's going to impact the last line of code and how everything else is going to fall in place in between. And writing a book is no different than that. When you write that first line, you have to understand where that book is going to end. So when I was first diagnosed at 22, there were a lot of negatives, but having them brought into the spotlight and understanding what they were, it gave me something that I could fix, something I could adjust. But we focused on the positives just as much as the negatives, and there were a lot of things that I could do that somebody who's quote unquote normal wasn't able to. So I doubled down on those, and they've given me a fantastic career.
I'm like, I don't know if it's okay to jump into just like a little bit of the ghost writing thing. Like I had never heard of that, and like just not like you writing a book and not getting credit and someone else putting their name on it and publishing. Like how does that all work? Like hey, I'm a writer, someone contracts you to write something, you send them the manuscript and then they go with the manuscript, or
Yeah, well, ghostwriting's been around forever. If you walk into a store and you see a book written by a celebrity, if their name is on the cover, most likely they didn't really write it.
yeah,
Britney Spears isn't writing novels. Like
yeah,
politicians don't write books. The occasional one will, but it's pretty rare.
yeah,
So they would bring in somebody like me, a hired gun, to basically write that book for them. It's called a work for hire situation. So they basically write a nice big check for you to do that, and then you walk away from the project. In my case, I could write it in their voice. So if I sat down with a politician, I would interview them. Sometimes for a couple of days, we'd hang out and just record a bunch of conversations. I could turn around and I could write that book in their voice as if they written it,
wow,
which is it's a unique skill set, and so it allowed me to from an income standpoint, I did really well doing that sort of thing. I did a lot of books for politicians, a lot of sports figures, a couple actors,
Yes.
and then I worked on the fiction side too. There was a New York Times bestseller who was about halfway through his book, but he had missed his deadline and he had to leave for a tour. like that tour couldn't be postponed. He had to go. So they handed me that book. They handed me the outline for the rest of it, and I wrote the second half of that book, and it came out with his name on the cover. Which is how it works. When you go in, you sign that contract, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But in a lot of ways, it made me bitter, because I knew I was doing the work and I wasn't getting the credit for it. But I gained a lot of experience doing all that too, because one of the things that I've learned since then as a published author, if you send your book off to your editor and there's something wrong with it, your editor will call you up and he's going to tell you two or three things that are fantastic about the book. And then he's going to tell you that one thing that he really needs you to fix. And then he's going to wrap up that phone call by telling you two other things that are good about the book because they want to leave you in that, with the positive take on that phone call.
Yeah.
When you're a hired gun brought in to fix somebody else's book, somebody else's problem, they don't sugarcoat anything. So they would tell me, this person can't write dialogue to save their life. They need to cut 30,000 words, but they don't know how to do it. This character development is terrible. Like they didn't sugarcoat anything. And I think hearing that unfiltered, diagnosis of a book, it really taught me, what the folks in New York were looking for and what it took to write a best-selling novel. A lot of people have asked me because I wrote my first book when I was 43. I was a little later in life. A lot of people have asked me if I would have wanted to start earlier. And the truth is probably not, because if I had written my first book in my 20s, I would have gotten it done, but I wouldn't have that learning curve behind me. And that's what's really taught me to write, the stuff that's selling today.
Yeah. That's
Were
awesome.
you writing when you were much younger, when you were in middle school, you said, and because your background isn't, well, I mean, at what age were you like, I am interested in writing?
I've been writing my whole life. I've got a sister who's 15 months younger than me. So we didn't have a TV in the house. So we went to the library all the time. And I had a little library that in my room, I would write stories. I would staple the pages together. She would check the stories out. I would charge her late fees. We were probably 4, 5, 6 years old when we were doing all that. I would write in journals and diaries when I was growing up because I wasn't quite sure that I wanted to do fiction, but I wrote pretty much every day on some level. In school, it was something, my teachers always highlighted, this kid's really good at writing, his writing assignments are phenomenal. So they would push that too. But I was getting pushback on the other side. My parents felt you can't make a living as an author. You have to go into the corporate world. They wanted me to get that desk job, so I was kind of getting it from both sides there. Even when I was in college, I wrote a paper. This is really going to date me, but back at the end of the 80s, when the Berlin Wall came down, a bunch of bands got on an airplane, Bon Jovi and a bunch of other rock bands, and went to Moscow and played a concert over there. So I wrote a paper about that for my English class in college. Not thinking much of it, but my English teacher took it and sent it off to the editor of Circus magazine. And he actually called me up and he put me on as an employee, as a reporter for a magazine he was starting up in South Florida. So writing has always kind of been, it's one of those things. I'm really good at it. I don't know why. I've never had any formal training, but it's always been there. It's always been part of my life.
Could you, yeah, I'm always so curious, what, the creative process, and I got a little bit when you're like, okay, I see the end and I see the character development and I just see the weave together that leads to that end. When it comes to the creativity of it, can you dive in a little bit more as to where the inspiration comes from, or what are some steps that you use, or is there a process that you use to go through the creative development?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. For me, every book comes together because of two different things. We've got our plot, our general scenario. This is what's going to happen. And then the characters. I think the characters to me are the most important part of every book. They need to be well fleshed out. They need to, feel like real people. I need to know them as if they're real people. And I can't start a book without having those two components. So to give you an example, I had a couple in mind, Brendan and Abby Hollander. It's a husband and wife. They've been married for about 10 years. They still love each other, but they're both kind of living separate lives. They both have full-time careers, so they see each other first thing in the morning. They see each other, at night after work, but they're exhausted. They kind of collapse, eat dinner, watch a couple minutes of Netflix, pass out, and sort of repeat their day. Which I think is, there's a lot of couples in this world, very, very
Yeah.
much like that. But I knew I wanted to write about them, and I took it a step further. I felt that Brendan, at some point, the husband, I wanted him to have an infidelity. Not quite, like he doesn't actually cheat, but he comes really close. I wanted to start whatever story I had with them in a therapist office. Basically they realize that they want to stay together, that this just happened. They know they have to fix something. They need to make a change. So I had these two characters in mind on my little, note document I have on my phone for probably 2 or 3 years, knowing that I wanted to put them in a story, but I didn't know what the story was going to be. Then one night, my wife and I, we were sitting around at dinner. My wife does a lot of real estate, and she had just bought a house in Georgia, and it was a pretty big house. It had 7 bathrooms in it. The whole place had to be renovated. So over dinner, we were talking about the potential renovation, and I brought up a company called Bath Fitters to do the bathrooms, which we've all seen the commercials. They come in one day and they do like a cosmetic facelift on a bathroom, and then they're gone. So we just casually discussed this over dinner. But that night, we both noticed commercials and ads for bath fitters popping up on our devices. All of a sudden, it was on our social media feeds. We had commercials on TV for bath fitters coming up. So I started to research this and realized that in the terms of service for our phone, we actually give them permission to listen to us 24/7. So my phone is sitting right next to me right now as I'm talking. It's listening to everything that we say. It's grabbing keywords out of the air. Those keywords are going into a database, and somebody's going to figure out how to make money from that data. So once I had that became the second part of Brendan and Abby's story. So we go back to them. We start off the book. They're in a therapist's office. They just confess this potential infidelity to a therapist, and the therapist tells them, "Okay, this is what I want you to do. When you go home, I want you to download this app to your phone. It's going to help you with bring you closer together. It's basically Truth or Dare for adults." And that was the essential form of the story of Behind a Closed Door, which is what the novel became. I started thinking about all that data, who has it, and what happens if that data falls into the wrong hands. So like all these pieces kind of had to come together. And once I had those, like I had my scenario, I knew Brendan and Abby as people. I could drop them into the middle of this thing and sort of watch it play out in my head like a movie and just write it all down.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that.
Wow. That's amazing. So Brett, JD, I've done my homework. I kind of done a deep dive on your website. So I have a question about this. For Erin doesn't know, maybe not, but you have this writers retreat that you have participated in. I believe that it's in Greece. Is that correct? This coming up. How did the writers retreat come about? This sounds like amazing trip, and you get to meet with like 4 other authors that participate. How did that come about?
Yeah, so that actually came out of Facebook of all places. There's a Facebook group of thriller fans, and it's really big. There's about 1.2 million people in it. And they tend to feature my books when they come out. So there's a lot of discussion about my books in that group. And I don't do a whole lot of social media myself, but that's probably the one Facebook group I like to check in with just because I relate to the people there. But the admins from the group started putting together these writer retreats. And then they reach out to people like me and ask if I want to attend. So in this case, this latest one is going to be in Greece. And it's fun. I get to hang out with other authors. I get to hang out with fans. We get to talk books in a very cool part of the world.
That's awesome. So JD, it sounds like you have taken kind of the skills and success of your writing work and now are helping adults with autism or children with autism find their creative outlets. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I speak at a lot of conferences. I talk to a lot of parents, because I've done well in life, and I was diagnosed late. But I think as I mentioned, I think like without autism, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today. So a lot of times I'll parents will reach out to me. They've got a 2-year-old kid, that isn't communicating, that beats its head against the wall, to the point where it bleeds, just screams, doesn't want to be touched. That was me. When I was that age. So, a lot of times it's very helpful for parents of a child like that to talk to somebody like me who's kind of on the other side of this, so they understand that there is a light at the end of that tunnel. And in a lot of ways, they really have to just find, what is that one thing that their child really likes. Once they get, can find that common ground with their kid, they can break through that shell that the child has around them. And they can learn to relate to them and start that dialogue, start communication. And a lot of times that's where all of this begins. So when you have an autistic child, especially at that age, it can seem extremely difficult. You don't know where it's going to go, what's going to happen. So I think talking to people who are successful on the flip side of it is very helpful. So I just try to get out there as much as I possibly can.
Yeah, that's
Awesome. we have a lot of people. I mean, so it seems just from talking to you, you were able to, I mean, you mentioned the eye contact, but you seem to be able to get over most of what some people describe as social issues around social issues around autism. We speak to a lot of people on our podcast at our campus here at Meristem. By I'm sure you've heard about our campus, which is
Mhm.
pretty. Oh, we'd love to have you onto our campus, but basically, stay at our bed and breakfast, right? We're talking to people that have so much social anxiety they couldn't do what you're doing right now or they could do it, but they would require a lot more like they just have a lot of anxiety. I'm sure you've been on numerous television programs promoting your books. Like, what are your keys to success for this?
Well, it's funny because there's two different aspects to this when you become quote unquote famous. Like
Mm,
if when I go to a TV show or I talk in front of a group of fans, I'm basically putting on the persona of an author. I'm mimicking what I feel an author should be. And a lot of the speeches are, talks that I've given over and over and over again. So I've been able to perfect the conversation. I know when the jokes are going to drop. I know how people are going to react to them. You have to tell these stories as if it's the first time you're telling them, even though it's the hundredth time or the thousandth time you've
mm,
told that story. So for an autistic person, that's actually pretty easy, because it's all scripted, in a lot of
mm,
ways. Now, where I run into problems is, like last weekend, my neighbor had a party. So my wife and I walked over to the neighbor's house, and I had to hang out with a group of people that I know, but I had no clue what was going to happen in each conversation. I had no idea who I was going to talk to. Like that to me is far more stressful than it is to I can get up in front of a group of 10,000 people. Doesn't bother me at all. But to hang out with
wow.
a beer in front of four neighbors and try to hold my own in a social situation, like that does not go away. But one of the things that when I was diagnosed, I went down a pretty dark path when I was younger because, when I was probably about 7 or 8 years old, other kids started picking up on the fact that I was different. And, I started picking up on the fact that they were picking up on it, which made me feel even more different. So I just retreated into myself. I went like 2 years without talking to anybody unless I had to. And after I was diagnosed and I realized all of this stuff was going on, I forced myself into these situations. Like when I know the situation is going to be tough, I force myself to do it. And I find that the more often I do it, the easier it gets. I could just as easily retreat and go back to being that guy, because I literally spend the day, by myself at a desk, talking to characters in my head, people that don't exist.
Mm,
That's my safe space. That's my happy spot. But I do stuff like this, just even getting out on a podcast, talking to other people, talking to other groups, because the more I do it, the easier it gets. And I can get over a lot of that anxiety. The eye contact thing, that's never gone away for me. It's always been there. Like if I'm in a conversation, if I'm making eye contact, I'm telling myself to do it, and it's difficult to do. It takes a lot of energy, a lot of stress, and it creates a lot of anxiety. And when I do that kind of thing, like I need to take some downtime after that. I have to recharge. I
mm,
think of like batteries. Like I need to, a couple hours of just alone time to kind of get myself back on track. Um, so I don't think a lot of these things don't go away. You just kind of learn how to deal with them. You can either, lock yourself in a room, all by yourself, which is what I did early on, or you can force yourself to deal with them and kind of push through it. And it for me, it got easier the more often I did it.
Yeah. I know when I was younger, like looking at people in the eyes was like uncomfortable because I just felt like I was taking in too much information. And I was just like, I don't want to take in that much information. So I like
yeah.
to look up or look down. I'm curious for you, like, when it's like meeting somebody's eyes, what that experience is like for you, and like what's the overwhelm from a sensory standpoint?
Yeah, I've never been able to quite identify it. It feels like whenever I'm in any kind of situation, like I want to take in every aspect of it, So like I want to know every corner of the room that I'm in, every sound, every smell, like I want to observe and remember all of it. And for the most part, I can. But when I look somebody in the eye, I don't know what it is, but like it's overwhelming. Like it's very difficult to do, and like I feel awkward doing it. It doesn't feel like it's a natural thing. Like it feels like looking somebody in the eye is something that I shouldn't be doing. So like every piece of my body fights that.
Yeah.
What I find strange is, like right now we're on a Zoom call. Like I can make eye contact with your video,
Yeah.
no, no problem. But in real life, like I wouldn't be able to do that. I don't understand why. maybe one day somebody will figure it out.
Yeah.
So it's easier, like when you're on TV program or you're on maybe even speaking to a crowd because you can look at the back of the room and you don't really have to look at any one person in particular. But you mentioned like, but going to a party where you have to actually make the eye contact is more challenging. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's unscripted. That's the thing. Like every talk that I give publicly is more or less a talk that I've given before. I just
Yeah.
modify it a little bit. So it's comfortable to me.
JD, what's it been like? Harry and I talked to a lot of people in the workforce, just navigating. You shared that early story working on the investment side of things, where it's like, man, I could crush this system and like be the like one of the best at the data analysis, but then talking to somebody or like delivering like, hey, man, that's actually not legal to do this transaction or something. What's your journey been like in terms of you know having to interact with people to just be as successful as you can, but I'm sure you're in negotiating contracts and things like that. What are some insights that you could share from your perspective of how you've learned to navigate that, and to the level of success that you've had?
I mean, like I mentioned earlier, I think I've doubled down on the positive aspects of this whole thing. Even when I was in the corporate world, I was like a human tape recorder. So if I was in the conference room in a meeting, somebody could come back to me, 6 months later and ask me, who said what and when, and I knew, like I remembered all of that. So like those skill sets became, part of what other people saw me as. They their benefits to other people too. So I think that was always a takeaway. I love playing chess, and it's one of those things that it presents itself in real life too. If you're in a negotiation, you're really thinking three moves ahead of wherever the conversation is, and that's partly I think why conversations in a social situation are problematic for me because somebody will say something out loud, and in my head I've already replied to that. I already know what they're going to respond with. I know what my response is to that. So the entire conversation is played out in my head before it's actually started, and I'm bored and I want to move on to something else.
Yeah.
So I have to kind of force myself to slow down. My daughter is 7, and she was recently diagnosed too. And she does something that's called cluttering, which I did as a child too. So somebody would ask me a question, and like 5 to 7 different answers would pop into my head all at the same time, and I would try to verbalize all those answers all at the same time. So they would all come out at once in this jarbled mess of words. So I learned over time to take a pause, a millisecond pause, grab one of those answers and just articulate one, which is something I learned long, long time ago. But like her being 7, like I can see her doing that. Like somebody asks her something and like she tries to speak and like all these words just kind of come pouring out of her. So the good news is, having an autistic parent, like I've been there, done that. Like I can
Yeah.
kind of hold her hand through a lot of these things and help her deal with it and explain it. Where I never had any of that. There was no
Yeah.
adult in my life that was helping me with any of this stuff.
That's pretty special. That's awesome. I'm gonna look up that word. You called it cluttering.
Cluttering, that's what we called it back with my therapist, and that's what we've told my daughter that's what it is. I don't know if that's the official term for it or not.
Yeah, I love that. I'm gonna look into that one because I even whatever the official term is, it still seems like a really good way to think about it. Because I just know, like when you have a mobile mind, like I have dyslexia, and to me it was always like, well, this word could, like, I don't really care what the spelling is. Like, this word could have like 50 different meanings or like 5 different meanings in like whatever the word is, the way it sounds. And to me, it was always like the sound and the articulation or the expression of the human being. And I always just like move beyond the physical structures of the words. And then in English, like for me, I was the opposite of you, probably. Math was more my strength, but like I just couldn't like fix letters into like what was coming through my mind. And so it's interesting just to think of it from like, okay, like I could just take one of the, like, just distill it down into the specific context of the moment. I like that.
I think we all tend to overthink everything. It gets us in a lot of trouble. A lot of times
Yeah.
the simplest answer is usually the right one.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, totally.
JD, you talk to a lot of parents. Are you speaking to parent groups? I can imagine. And some of the things that I understand that you talk about, like support systems and the like. Well, I'd like to ask you about the parent groups that you talk to, but also on that support system because we talk to a lot of people at Meristem in our job curriculum that we have a job exploration curriculum, one-to-one support for individuals, and we talk a lot about the importance of a support network, how important it is that they use their network and they really go into their network for help.
Yeah, I mean, I try to bring all that forward, because a lot of people don't see it. And in my own life, my wife's not autistic at all, so we tend to approach things from very different directions, especially when you're raising a child. Everything that I come up with is very logic based. There's no emotion involved in a decision. And my wife may come at it from the complete opposite direction. Her decision is 100% emotional. And we've learned over time to communicate those things and to, the right answer for us tends to be something somewhere in the middle. And that for me came out of therapy very early on, because when I first started dating my wife, like I could fake my way through a date. I could be a normal guy for a date. But the more and more time you start spending with somebody, you can only keep that wall up, that mask for so long. So we had to have that conversation. I had to explain to her that I was autistic. I had to explain what that meant. And ultimately, we got a therapist to kind of play mediator between the two of us, because we both knew that we wanted to make the marriage succeed, but we weren't quite sure how to do it, and we needed somebody to help us through that. And it all comes down to communication. We find that as long as we talk these things out, we're able to get to the other side of it. And that's something that I tend to, when I speak to parents, I try to highlight, because a lot of parents, when you're in a difficult situation like that, the normal human reaction is to shut down. It's to kind of go into your own little bubble and defend your own thoughts, your own decisions. But in reality, you really have to approach it as a group. So if you're parents with an autistic child, you have to approach that together. You can't do it as one. Um, Loop that child into the group. Like, you should all be part of the same circle. Like that closeness is extremely important. But when you're in that kind of situation, that under that kind of stress, we tend to gravitate towards our own isolated corners, and you have to fight that.
That's awesome.
Very impressive. Wow.
I'm just looking at time, Harry. Do you have any like one or two more bigger questions, or?
Oh, bigger questions. No, but I think that it's no. I just can't. I'm just grateful because, well, you've had just such a successful life as somebody with autism that it can be really empowering to a lot of people that think, oh, maybe they're going to struggle, or that they can't have success, or stuff like that. Um, yeah, but it seems like you've been able to handle it, and the anxiety, because we see a lot of anxiety is one thing that we see just a lot of people that like can't move forward, but it seems like you've created a toolbox, so to speak, in order to help you with that.
Yeah, JD, did you always have because something we like for our program, we always find someone who's more successful um, wants to change, like wants to wants to look at the pot, like the cup half full rather than half empty. Was that a trait that you just kind of naturally came out of yourself, or did you have to do work to change your perspective on your circumstance?
No, that's kind of my natural state of being. I'm always looking for ways to improve. If I accomplish one particular task, I'll look at that task, figure out what worked, what didn't work. I tend to focus on the negatives, if anything. If I have a fault there, I focus on the negative things, the things that didn't work, but only because I want to understand why they didn't work, so that I can fix them for next time. If you've got 8 things that went off correctly and 2 things that didn't, I prefer to focus on the 2 that didn't and try to make a perfect 10 out of the whole thing. But I'm one of those weird guys. I'm kind of a rainmaker. Like, no matter what situation you throw me in, I'm going to find some way to make it beneficial to me. I'm a millionaire for the 3rd time in my life. This is my 3rd career. Like, I know if I lost everything tomorrow, if you were to hand me a banana and say, you have to make a living with this banana, I'd
Yeah.
find some way to be a millionaire within another year using bananas.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that.
Wow.
Well, Just to close out, what are a few tips that you would give to anyone on the spectrum as they're, looking at their possible future, work, using their talents like you've been able to use your talents? Anything advice that you'd pass on?
Yeah, I mean, focus on those things that you're good at. One of the things that I did very early on, and I credit that therapist for doing that, is she forced me to make a list of everything that wasn't working and another list of everything that was. And we focused on both of those. We fixed the things that weren't working, and we doubled down on the ones that did. Writing to me was always on that positive list. So I doubled down on it. And I have yet to meet an autistic person who doesn't have some type of special skill. They may not know what it is straight off the bat. You may have to search for it, but it's there. There's always one thing that they are extremely good at, probably better at than anybody else around them. And once you isolate that and get them to focus on it, they can excel.
Very cool. Harry, you have anything else?
Yeah, no, but thank you so much for joining us, JD. This has been such a pleasure. We'd love to keep in contact, and we'll post all your information. Well, if you're watching on YouTube below, I'm not sure on the podcast apps. We'll put it where we can, and yeah. Any closing words, Erin?
Oh, just thank you, JD. I mean, it's really special to be able to talk to someone like you who's really kind of like at Meristem, we talk about transforming ourselves, and I think you've shown that at the highest level as a model and an example of, hey, I had challenges and I took those challenges and transformed them into, massive success in your life. And it's grateful to be able to talk to someone who's done that and continues to do that and is giving back in so many ways. So thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
Sweet. Well, yeah, I guess that's a wrap, Harry. Thank
Hang
you,
on.
JD. Yeah, as Harry said, we'll be in touch. And if you're ever in Sacramento, don't hesitate to drop us a line and come by. Or yeah, we'd just love to say hi or take you to our cafe and share some of what we do at our campus.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate it. Take care, guys.
Yeah, have a great rest of your day.
You too.